It's about when the Jews came back to Jerusalem and Judea from 70 years in captivity from Babylon. So what happened, the Persian king Cyrus had issued a proclamation that all these Jews that were being held captive in Babylon, any of them that chose to, he didn't make them, but he said, if you choose to, you can go back to Jerusalem, go back to Judea. And he said, I want you to rebuild the temple. And we believe that this happened. Ezra 1:1 says this happened in his first year as king. And I've mentioned before that I've got interested in studying this when Pastor recently finished his series on Daniel here in the auditorium on Wednesday night. And he mentioned that while studying the book of Daniel that he referenced both Isaiah and Jeremiah's prophecies. They occurred, 100 to 200 years before what we're looking at tonight. And Isaiah and Jeremiah both mentioned Cyrus by name as being God's servant to bring his people back to his city. And so what we believe, Josephus, the Jewish historian, he's in the 1st century, but he has volumes and volumes of Jewish history. He tells us that Daniel, who, as you know the story of Daniel, was the advisor to a series of Persian kings, that as soon as Cyrus got into office, he started showing Cyrus these Isaiah and Jeremiah prophecies from 100 to 200 years ago, so long before Cyrus was even born, that named him as the Lord's servant who would bring the Israelites back out of captivity back to Jerusalem. And so Josephus says that Cyrus was so impressed by that he did it. He thought, God must want me to do this. I think if that happened to me or you, we'd feel the same way. If somebody showed you or me a prophecy from 100 or 200 years ago about what I need to do that looked pretty legitimate, I think I'd be quick to do it. Anyway, so that's kind of what happened. And so Cyrus made the proclamation. He said anybody that wants to go back can. It was kind of a 3-part proclamation we read in Ezra 1. Second was that he was going to give the Jews back all the gold and silver items out of the temple that King Nebuchadnezzar had taken, and then he destroyed the temple. So he gave it back to him to take back so that once they rebuilt the temple, they could use these gold and silver objects in the temple. And the third part of the decree was that he told the Babylonians who the Jews lived among, they were in captivity, but they weren't in prison. They were made to stay in Babylon. He made a proclamation that the Babylonians were to gift the Jews as they left, to give them gold and silver and wares and just whatever they needed. And so the Jewish historians kind of call this the second Exodus, because it's so much like when the Israelites left Egypt. If you remember, the Egyptians were so happy to see them gone that they gave them lots of gold and silver and costly wares as kind of a going away present, get out of here quick type thing. And so this is called the second Exodus. Okay, then chapter 2 we looked at, and basically that just enumerates the clans of the Jews and names them and numbers them who chose to come back to Jerusalem. It numbers about 50,000 in all. And so they made this journey, and we know from the map from Babylon to Jerusalem, it's about 1,700 miles. And so we're talking about walking halfway across the United States. So we're talking about probably about a 4 to 5, maybe 6 month journey, depending on how fast you go and how the weather delayed them. So not an easy journey. So they really, really wanted to go back. That was their home, and that was where they belonged. And then chapter 3 talks about how they restored worship as soon as they got there at the site of the destroyed temple. So the temple, they found the foundation of the temple, the foundation where the altar was, and they restored worship there. And so that showed us that they had their priorities straight, that the most important thing was worshiping God in the proper way, because they knew that they understood that the reason they'd been sent into captivity was basically because they'd been worshiping idols, had not paid attention to God's prophets to try to get them back on the straight and narrow. Plus they had not been observing what's called the Sabbath year. Every 7th year the land was to lay at rest Sabbath rest every seventh year. And so the first lesson, as we went through all the prophecies about how if they didn't do that, they'd be taken to captivity. Anyway, so then we go to chapter 4, and we learn that as soon as they start the rebuilding effort, start gathering supplies, the locals, the people that had been moved in there by the Babylonian and Assyrian kings to occupy the land, to work the land so they could pay taxes to the Babylonian Empire, they didn't like this, because the Jews were kind of horning in on their property, so to speak. And so it says they discouraged the Jews. It starts out in chapter 4 saying they discouraged them. And so this went on for about 20 years. And so obviously there was opposition to what they were doing. We do know that the Samaritans sent letters to the current king of Babylonia, who was after Cyrus. His name was Artaxerxes. And they kind of laid out a bunch of lies about how they were rebellious and the Jews were rebellious and not going to pay taxes and all this. So Artaxerxes, doesn't know anything different, so he doesn't listen. He doesn't call the Jews in for their side of the story. He just gives a decree that Jews can't build the temple. Anyway, so the Jews kind of listened to these negative influencers and stopped the work for somewhere around 20 years. And then comes chapter 5. And that's where, as we said, we call that lesson defeating discouragement. They've been discouraged for 20 years. The way you defeat discouragers is you change your influencers. You change who you're listening to. So if you're listening to the news 6 hours a day and getting discouraged, change who you listen to. If the world is discouraging you, start looking at the Word. Start spending time in the Word. Anyway, so in chapter 5, verse 1, basically it says that they started listening to the prophets that came with them back from Babylon, Haggai and Zechariah. And through that they began to start building the temple again. So last lesson, that brings up the last lesson. So last lesson, what we did, we skipped over to the book of Haggai to see what it was he told them to get them back on track. It's very interesting. But basically, the bottom line on his message was, he mentioned it 2 or 3 times, consider your ways. Look at what you're doing. God brought you back here, with a purpose to rebuild the temple. You've been listening to all these heathens, these pagans that could care less about God's temple and you worshiping. Do what you're supposed to do. Consider your ways. And so that was the lesson last time. So tonight, what we're going to do is another little interesting side tour, and let me kind of explain that to you. Let's first look at the first scripture on your lesson sheet. So this is the last verse. We're kind of giving you a timeline here. The last verse in chapter 4 and the first 2 verses in chapter 5. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius. So Artaxerxes is no longer king. Now we have Darius, the king in Persia and Babylon. Now Haggai, so we're starting chapter 5. Now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, he was the political leader of the Jews, and Joshua, he was the high priest of the Jews, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. So here we have the time that the temple started being rebuilt was during the 2nd year of the reign of Darius. Okay? And then we skip down to chapter 6, 14, and 15, which we looked at last time, but I want to again set the timeline. So the elders of the Jews, this is when the temple was finished. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah. They finished building the temple according to the command of God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. So it took 4 years for them to rebuild the temple. So what I did this last time, since teaching, I read the book of Zechariah to see if there was something that the prophet Zechariah, who lived at this time, who was with them, who came back from Babylon, had something to tell them that might be beneficial for us. Sure enough, we're going to look at chapter 7 and 8 of Zechariah tonight and see an incident that happened during this building of the temple that we can have some take-home messages for. Okay, Zechariah 7:1. They're on your lesson sheet. In the 4th year of King Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month, and month of Kislev. So, temple started rebuilding in the 2nd year of Darius. It finished in the 6th year of Darius. The situation we're going to read about tonight happened in the 4th year. So this is about halfway through the rebuilding the temple. Something happens that Zechariah records that we can learn from. Okay, here's what happened. Chapter 7, verse 2 and 3. The people of Bethel sent 2 guys, I'm not sure I can pronounce their names, Sherezer and Regem Malik, together with their men, to entreat the Lord by asking the priest of the house of the Lord Almighty and the prophets, shall I mourn and fast in the 5th month, as I've done for so many years? Okay, so Bethel, let's back up a minute. So the Jews that came back from Babylon that we're reading about were from the what we used to call the southern kingdom. After Saul, David, and Solomon, Israel divided into a northern kingdom and southern kingdom. There were 10 tribes in the northern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin in the southern kingdom. The northern tribes went into idolatry much quicker than the southern tribes, and so they were taken to captivity by the Assyrians 100 years prior to this group being taken to captivity, and they were lost to the ages. They were scattered among all that kingdom, and those are considered the lost tribes. There's no Jew today that can trace his ancestry back to those 10 tribes. And so all the people that are Jews today are from Judah and Benjamin. And so Bethel is a town in the tribe of Benjamin, which is just north of Jerusalem, and then Judah includes the city of Jerusalem. So the only fast that was required of the Jews by God in all of his 600 laws back in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, was a fast yearly on what's called the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement. That was the only required annual fast. So something's happening here. These guys have been doing some extra fasts, and they're saying, should we continue doing this? So these people from Bethel obviously had been doing this fast in the 5th month, which was not the Day of Atonement. So actually, what we learn from this lesson is that they actually had instituted, because of the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, when the Jews went to Babylon, the priest, or the ones who are the religious leaders, had instituted 4 annual extra fasts because of what had happened. And so on the second column here at the top, these are actually referred to in the next chapter we'll get to a little bit later tonight, but I'll go ahead and put them in here to see what I'm talking about. 8:19 says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. This is kind of later on the answer to their question. The fast of the 4th month, the 5th month, the 7th month, and the 10th month shall become joyful and glad occasions. So the fellows that are coming and asking the priests and the prophets this question, what about this 5th month fast we've been doing? Well, this is sort of a test case. This 5th month fast was to them the most important of these 4 extra fasts that they had instituted. Josephus tells us what these fasts were. He's the Jewish historian. And he said the 4th month fast was to remember the day that the enemy breached the wall of Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar beat Jerusalem. The 5th month's fast was to remember the destruction of the temple. So apparently there was a day in the 5th month where Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. So that was why the 5th month fast was considered the most important. The 7th month fast mourned the death of Gedaliah. So when Nebuchadnezzar came and captured the Jews and took them back, some of the Jews were left. So he appointed a man named Gedaliah to be the governor, and he ended up being murdered. That story is in 2 Kings 25. And then the 10th month fast was to remember the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. So all 4 of these fasts had been done by the Jews once they got taken into captivity, because they were wanting to remember what had happened, to remind themselves of what had happened, and to remind themselves that, why this had happened, because they'd gone into idolatry and they weren't observing the Sabbath years that God had commanded of them. And so what's happening in this story tonight is these Jews up in Bethel are thinking to themselves, why are we still doing this? Why are we still doing this? We had these fasts that were commemorating the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the siege of Jerusalem, the death of the governor that Nebuchadnezzar put in power. But all that's past. We're back in Jerusalem. We're back in Judah and Benjamin. We're no longer in captivity. We're rebuilding the temple, and King Darius is paying for it. We learned about that last week, or 2 weeks ago. And so why are we still doing this? So, they know that they themselves, just as an isolated group, can't quit doing these fasts that the priests have said they need to do. So they just put the question to the priest, why are we still doing these things? Why are we still doing them? And so what we're going to learn in the rest of chapter 7 and 8 is that Zechariah answers them. Zechariah receives a word from the Lord, and he answers them what to do about these 4 extra fasts. Okay, so let's start seeing Zechariah's answers. Very interesting, because he doesn't really answer the exact question to the 4th. Zechariah gives them 4 answers that God gave him, and he doesn't really answer the question about the fast till the 4th one. He makes them wait till the end to get the answer, but he has a lot of stuff to tell them. Okay, let's look at God's first response. Then the word of the Lord Almighty came to me. Ask all the people of the land and the priest, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and the 7th months for the past 70 years, was it really for me that you fasted? And when you were eating and drinking, were you not just feasting for yourselves? So when they were in Babylon for 70 years, they did these 4 extra fasts a year. They've been back in Jerusalem, Judea, and Bethlehem for 20 years plus, the 20 years where they kind of got discouraged. Now they're 2 years in rebuilding. So for 92 years, they've been doing these extra fasts. But God's first response to them is, who were you doing this for? Who were you doing this for? Why were you really fasting? Why did you do what you do? Why are you doing this? It's kind of like Haggai said last week, consider your ways. So Zechariah, God saying through Zechariah, examine why you're really doing these fasts. And he says, were you really doing them for me, or were you really doing them for yourselves? So were you really fasting because of the sadness and sorrow for your sins that led to the captivity? Or were you really fasting out of self-pity because you had lost your freedom, you had lost your homeland, you had lost your wealth? Or maybe you were fasting to impress God. God, look how many times we're fasting every year now. You see, God knows our hearts. God knows our hearts. And so, God was giving Zechariah these words because he knew their hearts. And they're human just like we're human. And sometimes we get kind of messed up on how we think about why we're worshiping. A third way that maybe he said, were you fasting trying to obligate me? In other words, God, you've got to restore the temple. You've got to bring us back because look what we're doing for you. We're fasting 4 times every year. It's kind of like, you hear people say, I've got cancer, I've been in a bad car wreck, or I've lost my job, and, God, how can you do that? I go to church every Sunday. In other words, that's the feeling that we obligate God by our religious activities, that God has to do what we want him to. God has to be good to us, or give us this, or give us that, or don't let this happen because I show up at church every Sunday. So God, you are obligated to me. So God is giving Zechariah a word. Why were you really fasting? Examine your reasons for going through all these religious activities and see if it's the right reason. Are you doing it for the right reason, or are you doing it for yourself? Is it all about me, or is it all about you, Jews? Okay, verse 7. Are these not the words the Lord proclaimed to the earlier prophets, when Jerusalem and its surrounding towns were at rest and were prosperous, and the Negeb and the western foothills were settled? And so God is saying through Zechariah, I sent you prophets a long time ago, back when you ever went to captivity and you were in a prosperous society, things were going great, and he said those prophets are saying the same thing that the prophets are now saying. He said, but you didn't obey then. You didn't listen to them. So I want you to listen to these guys. And so God is trying to say through Zechariah, the most important thing to me is that you obey me, that you obey my word. You show your love for me by your obedience, not by going through some rituals of worship, living your life like you want to, than just showing up to worship every once in a while thinking that's you're good to go. He said, that's the last thing I want. I want a life of daily obedience, not a life where you do what you want to and just occasionally do some kind of worship ritual and think you're good to go and you obligate me. God's second response, chapter 7, verse 8 through 10. And the word of the Lord came to Zechariah. This is what the Lord Almighty said. Administer true justice, show mercy, and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other. So the first response was, you need to be obeying me, not just doing some kind of ritual of worship. So the second response is, okay, you want me to give you a list? Here's your list. Here's some stuff you need to be doing. If you want to say you love me and you say you're going to obey me, I'm looking at how you treat other people. Not just your friends, not just your family. I'm talking about everybody. And so he gives us a list. He says, number one, here's the type of behavior that I expect people that say they're my followers to do. So if he said that to us, we'd say, if you're Christians, this is what I expect out of you. This is what I expect to see in your life. This is not a suggestion. This is how you obey God. He said, number one, you got to be kind to each other. And notice something about all these. These are not necessarily hard things to do. Now, some people, it may be hard to be kind to, but they're all choices. These are all things that we choose to do, or we can choose not to do in interaction with some other person. So these are choices, but all of us have the capability of doing each one of these. Number one, be kind to one another. Number two, show mercy to one another. Number three, render true judgments with each other. Number four, do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. So what's the deal with these folks? Well, that was a patriarchal society where the head of the household basically would stand up for the cause and plead the cause of somebody. So if a woman is a widow, she no longer has her husband to plead her cause. That's kind of how they did it in that society. If you're an orphan, you don't have a father to plead your cause. If you're a foreigner and you're from some other country, you don't have a Jewish father to plead your cause. And then, of course, the poor often have a hard time being heard in any society. And so God says, especially show mercy and kindness to the folks that don't have somebody that plead their cause. And then number 5, he says, don't plot evil against each other. So again, God is saying, I'm not really impressed by your wealth. I'm not impressed by your status. I'm not impressed by your extra fast. I'm not impressed by your religious activities. What I'm looking for is obedience in your daily life, and you can show that by the way you treat other people. You know, the old saying you would hear at church was, the ground is level at the cross, meaning it's the same for everybody. You know, one person, because of his status or wealth or color or race or whatever, you know, isn't closer to Jesus than somebody else. The ground is level at the cross. Maybe the new way of saying would be, all lives matter the same. To God, all lives matter the same. So if we're his followers, we have to have the same attitude, because we're to look at people like God looks at people. Remember back in Sunday school, we sang the song, red and yellow, black and white, they're all precious in his sight. And so if red and yellow, black and white are all precious in God's sight, they have to be precious in my sight if I'm to be a follower of Jesus. Okay, next page, verse 11 through 14. So God is continuing to talk through Zechariah about kind of how the Jews were back before they became in captivity. But they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their ears that they might not hear. They made their hearts diamond hard, lest they should hear the law and the words that the word of the host had sent by his Spirit through the former prophets. Therefore great anger came from the Lord of hosts. As I called, and they would not hear. Listen to this. This is pretty strong. As I called, in other words, God calling to his people, and they would not hear, so they called, and I would not hear. Interesting, huh? Says the Lord of hosts. And I scattered them with a whirlwind among all the nations that they had not known. So this is talking about the dispersion of the captivity. Thus the land they left, Judea, was desolate, so that no one went to and fro, and the pleasant land was made desolate. Was made desolate. You know what the hardest substance on the earth is? Diamonds. You know, I read that and I thought, wow. God knew what the hardest substance on the earth was 2,500 years ago, long before we did. And I thought, well, would they know what diamonds were? And so I looked in my Strong's Concordance to see when the first time diamonds were mentioned in the Old Testament. Anybody know? When they left Egypt, Moses was given from God a description of the vestment of the high priest. And there were 12 precious stones to represent the 12 tribes, and one of them was a diamond. So they did have diamonds, and they knew exactly what Zechariah was talking about here. Anyway, so God says, so back when you were not being obedient to me, not living like you should, you still called out to me, but you weren't listening to me. But because you didn't listen to me, I didn't listen to you. Now, he's not talking about people that are striving to serve God and be the best they can. He's talking about people that call themselves God's people but have absolutely nothing to do with God. And so maybe that's a chastisement that God's talking about to try to bring them back to him by not listening to them. That makes sense? So the question comes to me and comes to you. If God tells me something to do in his word, like that list we just read, but I refuse to do that, I think, well, this person doesn't deserve my kindness and mercy. If I'm not going to do what God tells me to do, then when I call out to him, why should I expect him to listen? Right? If I'm not willing to turn my heart towards him, I just want to be called a Christian. But I want to live my life like I want to and not have God tell me how to live. Why should he listen to me? He tells the Jews, that's why I quit listening to you. Okay, let's go to God's third response. chapter 8, 1 and 2. And the word of the Lord of hosts, and we don't know how much time was between these responses. It doesn't tell us. Doesn't really matter, I guess. And the word of the Lord of hosts came, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts. This is an amazing verse. Look at this. So this is God talking about how he feels about his people. I am jealous for Zion with great jealousy. I am jealous for her with great wrath. So 3 times in one verse God says, I am jealous for you. And great wrath means tremendous, tremendous passion. So it hurt. God is saying it hurt me to be estranged from you. When you were in captivity and you weren't in the promised land and you weren't worshiping in the temple. You know, because in the Old Testament times God dwelt in the Holy of Holies in the temple, but the temple was now destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So he's talking about how he could hardly bear this estrangement. You know, back, those of you who are my age or so can remember years ago there was a frequent illustration that preachers would give. You can't really give it now because of the way cars are made, but back when the front seats were all bench seats, you know, the illustration was, okay, you're dating, and so you got the girl always sits in the middle while they're dating. Then you get married and you have kids, you know, and eventually the woman kind of slides over and sits in the passenger seat, you know, and the kids are in the back hollering and screaming. Anyway, but, you know, in a nostalgic time, the wife tells the husband, man, remember those neat times when I used to sit next to you in the car and we'd snuggle up and watch the movie, and the man would say, I didn't move. Remember that illustration? I heard it 100 times back when I was a kid. Anyway, so the point here that God's trying to say is, I'm the same. I haven't moved. You guys are the ones that moved. Y'all moved away from me, and it hurt me. I yearn for you. I'm jealous for you. I want to have relationship with you. But you see, God feels, I think, you know, God's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I think he feels the same way about us. You know, if someone comes to him and accepts Jesus as Savior and says, I'm a child of God, God is now jealous for you and for your loyalties and for your obedience and for your life and for your worship. And he doesn't want you moving back to the other side of the car. He wants you to stay next to him. Stay snuggled up with him. And it hurts him when you're not, when you're choosing to move away. Because he said, I never moved. I never moved. Verse 4 and 5. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each of them with cane in hand because of their age. See, they had canes back there. They didn't have walkers, but they had canes. The city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there. So now he's talking about that, you know, the temple's being rebuilt, and so Jerusalem is getting repopulated, and so you know, we know now that Nebuchadnezzar comes next and he rebuilds the walls. And so basically God is saying through Zechariah, normal is coming back. Normal is coming back to Jerusalem. The old folks will be sitting around visiting, the kids will be playing in the streets. So they had not had normal for 92 years. We haven't had normal for 9 months and we're about to die. You know, 92 years. Obviously a lot of folks have come and gone with them, you know. Verse 6 through 8. This is what the Lord Almighty says. It may seem marvelous to the remnant of the people at that time, but will it seem marvelous to me, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will save my people from the countries of the east and the west. I will bring them back to live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be faithful and righteous to them as their God. And so God through Zechariah is saying these promises may seem marvelous to you, but it's really nothing to me. You know, I can do anything I want to. That's why he said, but will it seem marvelous to me? That's just, you know, today, that, you know, God, that's a stroke of a hand. You know, he can make things happen. So nothing is too hard for me. Okay, now let's come to that fourth response we've been waiting for, where he actually gives them an answer. to their question about what should we do about all these extra fasts? Do we have to keep doing them? Verse 9, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Now hear these words, let your hands be strong so that the temple may be built. This is also what the prophets said who were present when the foundation was laid for the house of the Lord Almighty. So he's saying, you guys got to keep listening to these prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. That's who God has sent to be with you to tell you what I want you to do. And he said, be strong, let your hands be strong. He's saying, keep your faith strong, your character strong. You must obey me, do those things I've told you to do. Listen to the prophets. He said, then good things will happen. Let's skip down to verse 16 through 17. These are the things you are to do. This is kind of like rerun, but like, get this down, guys. This is how I want you to act. Speak the truth to each other. Render true and sound judgments in your courts. Do not plot evil against each other, and do not love to swear falsely. Don't tell lies. He said, I hate all this, declares the Lord. So again, he's giving them another do list, very similar to the do list we saw a while ago. But God is saying, I hate it when people do these things, because that's not me. And if you're my people, you are to be me. I'm to be living in you, and you do things like I would do them. You treat people like I would treat them. You look at people like I would look at them. And if you're not doing that, you're not really being the person I want you to be. He said, I hate it when people don't do these things. I hate it. Verse 18 and 19. Here it comes. The word of the Lord Almighty came to me. This is what the Lord Almighty says. The fasts of the 4th month, 5th month, 7th month, and 10th month will become joyful and glad occasions and happy festivals for Judah. Therefore love truth and feast. Truth and peace. So basically he said, all this extra fasting you've been doing, do away with the fast. Let's turn your fast into feast, because you're back where you need to be. You're rebuilding the temple. You're back to worshiping me like you should. He said, this is a time of joy, a time of gladness. No longer a time of sorrow when you fasted. Now it's a time of gladness. So let's have some extra feasts. Verse 20 to 23. So he closes out these 4 answers with a little bit of prophecy. Let's see what he says. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Many peoples and the inhabitants of many cities will yet come. And the inhabitants of one city will go to another and say, let's go at once to entreat the Lord and seek the Lord Almighty. I myself am going. And many peoples and powerful nations will come to Jerusalem to seek the Lord Almighty and to entreat him. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In those days, anytime you see that in a prophecy, he's talking about the end times, the future times. In those days, 10 people from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you. So Zechariah is closing these 4 answers with a prophecy about the Messianic kingdom in those days. And he's saying Gentiles from all around the world will make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem during this Messianic kingdom to seek the Lord. And so at that time, Jews will be God's messengers as God originally intended them to be. And this 10-to-1 ratio basically represents the vast numbers of Gentiles that will come into the kingdom during the Messianic kingdom. And the Messiah in the midst of millennial Israel will be the attraction of the world. Okay, so let's see what we can learn from this lesson tonight. Three lessons I put down here. Number 1 is pretty obvious. God yearns for our fellowship. Chapter 8, verse 2, he said, I'm jealous, I'm jealous, I'm jealous for you. I'm jealous. With a great wrath, which means a burning passion. And so God's saying, I don't want any competition for your loyalty to me. And don't you know the world, through the enemy, is trying to just throw stuff at us all day long to compete with our loyalty to God. Because if he can change our loyalty, then basically we become ineffective Christians. So God tells them, you weren't doing all this extra fasting out of a burning love for me. It was out of a self-pity, or it was out to impress me, or it was out to obligate me, to bring you back. He said, you just don't understand the burning love that I have for you and for all my people, and I want you to feel the same for me. I didn't have room on the lesson sheet to include this, but talking about this verse of jealousy, 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 I went to one of my references, and this is what this fellow says. I think he explains it pretty good about God's jealousy has to do with loyalty, how loyal he is to us, and he wants and desires the same loyalty from us to him. So listen to this. God's point of view is not our point of view. We forget that. We judge him by human standards, but he's not human. He is something completely other and cannot be judged by any standard but the one he sets for himself. For God, jealousy is a measure of his devotion, his passionate caring for us. For him, it is a fire that consumes his enemies, but it also protects and provides for those who belong to him. This quality, something we would look at as possessiveness, should probably more accurately be translated loyalty. For this is the way God is using it here. He is absolutely, dependably loyal to us. He keeps his word even when we don't keep ours. His call is irrevocable. This is the loyalty he gives, but this is also the loyalty he requires from us as a measure of our true love and commitment. We are casual about loyalty. God isn't. We feel slightly guilty at betraying a trust, but it's not the worst thing. It's not like murder or something. There is no worse thing in God's lexicon of values than disloyalty. For God, everything is in covenant relationship based on putting him and what he requires first and foremost in our lives. Everything depends on loyalty and trust. So God simply wants us to have the same burning passion and jealousy for him that he has for us. Second lesson, daily obedience is better than shows of worship. Did you see that in those four responses? I mean, twice he gave lists of things for them to do. Had nothing to do with showing up at church. He said, I want you to treat people right. I want you to treat people just like I treat them. I want them, do good, show mercy, right judgments, don't think about evil things, especially take care of those who can't speak for themselves and take care of themselves. He said, that's how you show obedience, because you're becoming my hands and my feet when you do the things that I want done with other people. And so he said, that's what I want to see from you. Now, you say, well, what about coming to church? Well, if your life is set on obeying God and doing what he says, worshiping will be part of that. That's a natural outpouring of that. That's not something you do to check off and say, God, I came to church this Sunday, you owe me a good life. Whole different attitude. You're still at church, but you're there for a different reason. You're there because you love God and you're obeying him, and you wouldn't be anywhere else if you could avoid it. And so you're here to worship in spirit and truth, not here to worship in a spirit of getting God to be obligated for you. Number 3, Jesus is coming again. So Zechariah gives us all these things. At the end he said, hey guys, the good news is Jesus is coming back. The Messiah will come back. Of course, they haven't had the Messiah at that point, but he's casting vision for them. And throughout the Old Testament, the Bible's clear. Jesus is coming again, and this time, second time, he's not coming as a babe in a manger. He's coming as the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He's going to establish a kingdom that will rule the nations of the earth with a rod of iron. And so Zechariah says in that day, he's going to be the attraction of the world. He's going to be sitting on the throne of Jerusalem with the attraction of the world, and people, anybody that has any sense, will want to come and see him there. Anyway, so that's, I hope you got something out of that. That's a lesson that's kind of a detour off of Ezra, and I might think most of us had never studied Ezra, which I had not, and then to look at it and see what these prophets were saying to them during the time of Ezra, I think it's very interesting. So I hope you got something out of that. I think it speaks to us. That's the thing about the Bible, that yes, it was speaking to them, but it speaks to us, and that's why Paul said the old covenant, the old word, the old Testament is for our instruction. In other words, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because we have a new covenant, a New Testament. We can learn so much from how God dealt with his people then, because God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Anyway, thank you for attention. Let's stand and we'll have our closing prayer. Thank you for being here.